tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? In what distant deeps or skies burnt the fire of thine eyes? On what wings dare he aspire? What the hand dare seize the fire? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hand and what dread feet? What the hammer, what the chain, in what furnace was thy brain? What the anvil, what dread grasp dare its deadly terrors clasp? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye dare frame thy fearful symmetry? This video is all about poetry. That was The Tiger by William Blake, and I memorized that poem in 5th or 6th grade when my cousin brought it home from college and shared it with me just because I happened to like tigers, and I would walk around reciting it endlessly as a 5th or 6th grader. Soon my other 2 cousins who were my age had it memorized because I wouldn't stop reciting it to them, and the 3 of us would march around reciting William Blake's The Tiger. So it's tempting to think of poetry as being fancy and boring, not for kids, but that's only because school made it seem that way. Poetry for children should emphasize the fun and liveliness of language. It helps them hear the patterns and the play that's possible with rhymes and word jokes. And poetry really just treats language like clay for molding and sculpting into something creative and something fun and something new and something interesting. There's a lot of educational benefits to it, but it's also just fun, and that gets lost. So we all recognize poetry. Poetry can be described as a form of writing that uses carefully selected and arranged language to evoke meaning. But what is it really? A format? A genre? It doesn't really fit nicely into either term. So poetry is often called a genre, and you'll hear that a lot. And it's sometimes placed alongside fiction and nonfiction. Remember that genre is all about a type of content. It's what's inside. So it's not very helpful at many times to consider poetry a genre because poems don't all have the same type of content. Some poems contain stories that clearly belong in another genre like fantasy or contemporary realistic fiction, and some of them even convey information, non-fictional information, and many poems don't contain a story or a specific kind of information at all. So some people actually will squeeze poetry into nonfiction because if you define nonfiction as anything but fiction, then a lot of poetry will fit in there, but not the poetry that tells stories, so it still doesn't really work very well. In some ways, poetry is like a format. Remember that a format is the shape that a story is in, or the shape that the text is in. It's the container that holds genres, and poetry can hold genres, and different types of poems have different shapes and rules for how they're structured, so that kind of works. However, poems aren't a physical thing like a book, and poems themselves can be contained inside of formats like picture books and middle grade novels and all of that. So I personally find it most helpful to treat poetry as its own category, outside of genre and format. Remember that the end goal of these terms, all these categories, is to be able to efficiently describe texts and be able to compare them to other similar texts. So rather than trying to shove poetry into genre or format, it's productive to be able to describe a book by its genre, its format, and whether it's poetry. So if you're describing a book, like, for instance, haiku, then it's helpful to know that this is a nonfiction picture book describing the seasons, with some elements of animal fantasy in the pictures, like this little panda who gets dressed up in a scarf and a raincoat. And that's a lot of good information to help me categorize and recommend this book to a young reader. But if you tell me that it's a nonfiction picture book that combines animal fantasy pictures with haikus, then that gives me a lot more information to work with. I have a much better idea of what the book is like, and I'll understand the joke in the title, haiku. Likewise, if you describe Love That Dog as a contemporary realistic fiction chapter book, and I started reading it just based on that description, I'd probably be pretty baffled when I opened it up and found that it was written entirely in poetry. This kind of format even has a name, this combo of novel and poems, and it's called a novel in verse. So books like these, Don't isolate poetry as a special topic to be studied seriously in an advanced English class and with no smiles allowed. Great poetry books for kids demonstrate how poetry is just another way of playing with language and fits right in alongside stories and topics that they already like to read about. So, when you're thinking about poetry, remember to have fun.